Hello, class, and welcome to This Week in Health Psychology. This week we will assess whether stress causes illness and then explore a chronic and acute model of the mechanisms behind this association. We will then explore the relationship between stress and illness in terms of behavioral and physiological pathways. We will then approach the idea of Psychoneuroimmunology, PNI, and explore the impact of psychological factors such as mood, beliefs, emotional expression, and stress on immunity. Finally, we will highlight the role of coping, social support, personality, and control as moderators of the stress-illness link. Now, let's start off by exploring the issue, does stress cause illness? One of the reasons that stress has been studied so consistently is because it is of its potential effect on the health of the individual. Research shows that hypertension rates are more common in those with high-stress jobs, such as air traffic controllers, than in less stressed occupations such as working as a nun, for example, and that higher life stress is associated with greater reporting of physical symptoms. Further, both cross-sectional and longitudinal studies show that stressful occupations are associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease. In addition, researchers indicate that vital exhaustion is common in the year preceding a heart attack. In one study, people were given nasal drops, either containing viruses responsible for the common cold or a placebo saline solution. The level of stress was then assessed in terms of life events during the past year. The results showed that not everyone who was given the virus contracted the virus, and not everyone who did contract the virus actually exhibited cold symptoms and became ill. Stress, however, was shown to predict, first, who contracted the virus, and second, who developed symptoms. However, these studies involved a cross-sectional, prospective, and retrospective design, which raises the problem of causality, as it's unclear whether stress causes illness or illness causes stress, or stress ratings. To solve this problem, some research has used an experimental design which involves inducing stress and assessing subsequent changes in health. Because of the obvious ethical problems with such a design, most experimental work has been done using animals. Now, a classic series of animal studies was carried out by Manick, Kaplan, and their colleagues, and they experimentally manipulated the social groupings of Bowman gray monkeys, who have a very strong social hierarchy. And the results showed that the monkeys illustrated not only behavioral signs of stress, but also a marked increase in the disease of their coronary arteries. In addition, stress management, which involves experimentally reducing stress, had some success in reducing coronary heart disease and in reducing recurrent cold and flu in other individuals. Now, how does stress cause illness? Well, according to Johnston in 2002, they argued that stress can cause illness through two interrelated mechanisms, and developed his model of the stress-illness link, which involves chronic and acute processes. The chronic process, the most common held view of the link between stress and illness, suggests that stress leads to disease due to a prolonged interaction of physiological, behavioral, and psychological factors. For example, chronic work stress can cause changes in physiology and changes in behavior, which over time lead to damage to the cardiovascular system. In particular, chronic stress is associated with atherosclerosis, which is a slow process of arterial damage that limits the supply of blood to the heart. Further, this damage might be greater in those individuals with a particular genetic tendency. Now, this chronic process is supported by research indicating links between job stress and cardiovascular disease. And such an approach is parallel to Levy's stress diathesis model of illness. However, there are several problems with a purely chronic model of the stress-illness link. First off, exercise protects against the wear and tear of stress, with more active individuals being less likely to die from cardiovascular disease than more sedentary individuals. However, exercise can also immediately precede a heart attack. So the wear and tear caused by stress can explain the cumulative damage to the cardiovascular system, but this chronic model does not explain why coronary events occur when they do. So in light of these problems, Johnston also argues for an acute model. And within the acute process, heart attacks are more likely to occur following exercise, following anger, upon wakening, during changes in heart rate, and during changes in blood pressure. They are acute events and involve a sudden rupture and thrombogenesis. Johnston argues that this reflects an acute model of the link between stress and illness, with acute stress triggering a sudden cardiac problem. And so this explains how exercise can be protective in the longer term, but a danger for an at-risk individual. It also explains why and when a heart attack occurs. So the acute and chronic processes are intrinsically interlinked. Chronic stress may simply be the frequent occurrence of acute stress. Acute stress may be more likely to trigger a cardiac event in someone who has experienced chronic stress. And acute stress may also contribute to the wear and tear on the cardiovascular system. Furthermore, both the chronic and acute processes highlight the central role for stress-induced changes in behavior and changes in physiology. So, when we look at stress and changes in behavior, stress has been mostly studied in the context of coronary heart disease. However, there are also studies exploring links between illnesses such as cancer, diabetes, and recovery from surgery. Research exploring the links between stress and coronary heart disease highlight the impact of stress on the classic risk factors of coronary heart disease, namely raised blood cholesterol, raised blood pressure, and smoking. And these risk factors are strongly influenced by behavior and reflect the behavioral pathway between stress and illness. In line with this, some research has examined the effect of stress on specific health-related behaviors. Now, stress and illness onset and progression is something that is important to be looked at. So stress causes changes in both the sympathetic activation, so things like heart rate, sweating, blood pressure, through the production of catecholamines in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical activation via the production of cortisol. These changes can directly impact upon health and illness onset. So the sympathetic activation, with that, we're looking at prolonged production of adrenal and noradrenaline, so epinephrine or norepinephrine, which can result in the following: blood clot formation, increased blood pressure, increased heart rate, irregular heartbeats, fat deposits, plaque formation, and immunosuppression. And these causes may increase the chance of heart disease and kidney disease and leave the body open to infection. There is also the HPA activation. So the prolonged production of cortisol can result in decreased immune function, as well as damage to neurons, for example, in the hippocampus. And these changes may increase the chances of infection, psychiatric problems, and losses in memory and concentration. These physiological changes can be further understood in terms of Johnston's chronic and acute model of the stress-illness link. Chronic stress is more likely to involve hypothalamic pituitary adrenal activation and the release of cortisol, and the result is ongoing wear and tear and the slower process of atherosclerosis and damage to the cardiovascular system. Acute stress operates primarily through changes in sympathetic activation, with changes in heart rate and blood pressure, and this can contribute to atherosclerosis and kidney disease, but is also related to sudden changes such as heart attacks. So there is clearly an interaction between the behavioral and the physiological pathways. Stress is really something that influences health and illness by changing behavior or by directly impacting upon an individual's physiology. So far we've talked about behavior and physiological pathways as separate and discrete. However, this is very much an oversimplification. Stress can cause changes in behavior such as smoking and diet, which impact upon health by changing the individual's physiology. Likewise, stress may cause physiological changes such as raised blood pressure, but this is often most apparent in those that also exhibit particularly unhealthy behaviors. Therefore, in reality, stress is linked to illness via a complex interaction between behavioral and physiological factors. Moreover, Johnston and the research of others has argued that these factors are multiplicative. That is, they multiply each other, indicating that the more factors that are changed by stress, the greater the chance that stress will lead to illness. Now, not everyone who experiences stress becomes ill. To some extent, this is due to the role of variables such as coping, control, personality, and social support, which we'll talk about at the end of this lecture. However, research indicates that this variability is also due to individual differences in stress reactivity, stress recovery, allostatic load, and stress resistance. Stress reactivity, for example, some individuals show a stronger physiological response to stress than others, which is known as their level of cardiovascular reactivity or stress reactivity. And this means that when given the same level of stressor, and regardless of their self-perceived stress, some people show greater sympathetic activation than others. So, when we speak of the allostatic load, we're speaking really of the reflecting the wear and tear in the body which accumulates over time after exposure to repeated or chronic stress. Researchers will argue that the body's physiological systems constantly fluctuate as the individual responds and recovers from stress. So a state of allostasis, and that as time progresses, recovery is less and less complete, and the body is left increasingly depleted. Therefore, if exposed to a new stressor, the person is more likely to become ill if their allostatic load is quite high. Stress resistance then reflects the observation that not all individuals react to stress in the same way. Researchers developed the concept of stress resistance to emphasize how some people remain healthy even when stressors occur. Now, speak a little bit of psychoneuroimmunology. So stress has obviously been linked to a range of illnesses, and research highlights the role of both a behavioral and physiological pathway. So one area of research that emphasizes the physiological pathway and has received much interest over recent years is psychoneuroimmunology, PNI. Psychoneuroimmunology is based on the prediction that an individual's psychological state can influence their immune system via the nervous system. Now, this perspective provides a scientific basis for the mind over matter, or think yourself well, and positive thinking, positive health approaches to life. Now, when we look at the psychological state and immunity, researchers focused on the capacity of psychological factors to change immune functioning. In particular, it has examined the role of mood, beliefs, emotional state, and emotional expression, and stress. So let's take a look at mood studies. Mood studies indicate that positive mood is associated with better immune functioning, that negative mood is associated with poor functioning, and that humor appears to be specifically beneficial. Some researchers have explored the impact of mood on the progression of disease, disability, and survival in patients. And what they found is that by looking at 38 consecutive patients completing measures of mood, so anxiety and depression, self-esteem, well-being, and disability at time of diagnosis, and after 6 weeks, survival and disability were also measured after 6 months. 10 patients had died by 6 months. Controlling for disease severity, the results showed that those who died reported lower mood at the 6-week interview, and that low mood at 6 weeks was also predictive of greater disability in the survivors. Belief. It's also been suggested that beliefs may themselves have a direct effect on the immune system. Some researchers have reported that an internal, stable, global attributional style, for example, a pessimistic approach to life whereby individuals blame themselves when things go wrong, that predicts poor health in later life. And this has been supported by positive psychology researchers who argued that pessimism may be related to health through a decrease in T cells and immunosuppression. Some researchers have argued that this was not mediated through behavioral changes, but was indicative of a direct effect of attributional style and beliefs on physiology. Then there is emotional expression, and there is evidence that certain coping styles linked to emotional expression may relate to illness onset and progression. For example, some studies have suggested that suppression and denial are associated with poor health outcomes. Other studies have focused on emotional non-expression and on emotional inexpressive coping styles, known as the Type C personality, and have described a link with illness. While other researchers have highlighted the importance of a repressive coping style. So this research consistently indicates that non-expression of emotions, or particularly negative emotions in stressful situations, can be harmful for health. There's also evidence that encouraging emotional expression through writing or disclosure groups is beneficial for health. Stress can cause illness through physiological changes such as raised heart rate, blood pressure, heartbeat irregularities, and an increase in fatty deposits. It can also result in changes in immune function. So when researchers did research on rats, it showed that stressors such as tail pinching, loud noise, and electric shock can produce immunosuppression. Research in humans shows a similar picture. One area of research which has received much attention relates to the impact of caregiver stress. In some earlier studies, researchers explored differences in wound healing between people who were caring for a person with Alzheimer's and a control group. Using a punch biopsy, which involves removing a small area of skin and tissue, they explored the relationship between caregiver stress and the wound healing process. The results showed that wound healing was slower in the caregivers than the control group. The wound healing paradigm has also been used to show links between stress and slower healing in students during an exam period, and slower healing using high-resolution ultrasound scanning, which is more accurate than the more traditional measurement strategies involving things like photography. Some researchers argue that stress causes a decrease in the hormones produced to fight carcinogens and repair DNA. In particular, cortisol decreases the number of active T cells, which could increase the rate of tumor development. And this suggests that stress, while ill, could exacerbate the illness through physiological changes. Such stress may occur independently of the illness. However, stress may also be a result of the illness itself, such as relationship breakdown, changes in occupation, or simply the distress from a diagnosis. Therefore, if the illness is appraised as being stressful, this itself may be damaging to the chances of recovery. So to close out this lecture, I want to highlight some final aspects of the complexity of this whole situation. Which factors moderate this stress-illness link? So, on a positive note, the relationship between stress and illness is not straightforward, and there is a lot of evidence to suggest that several factors may moderate the stress-illness link. And these factors include things like exercise. Exercise can cause a decrease in stress. Coping styles. Those individuals that have the type of coping styles that are very expressive may well mediate this stress-illness link and determine the extent of the effect of the stressful event on their health status. Social supports. An increased social support has been related to a decreased stress response and a subsequent reduction in illness. Personality. It's been suggested that personality may influence the individual's response to a stressful situation and the effect of this response on health. And this has been studied particularly with a focus on type A behavior and personality and the role of hostility. And then the whole idea of actual or perceived control. Control over the stressor may decrease the effects of stress on the individual's health status. So, those are some things to consider when evaluating stress and considering your own health within life. So that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.